But I don't have to keep track of time. Yes, I have an hour here. Okay, so I guess I'll kick off the day with the orchestrating activities with Jenkins. So the Stuart already, I guess, did a show of hands, which was something I was planning to do. But just in case you haven't heard of this guy, right, so he's Mr. Jenkins. When I first came up with this software, I like this notion of giving the software the name of the person, because we started thinking of him as another person in the development team. And then so, the butler sounded like a kind of name that would serve other people, and then the Jenkins sort of sounded like a British butler name, at least in my sense. And then so he became Jenkins. Actually, don't know if for the British people it sounds like a British butler name or not. You have to tell me afterward. So right now we track about 64,000 installations of Jenkins around the world. And then so that makes Jenkins the most adopted continuous integration server in the world. And we placed a lot of emphasis on ease of use and ease of installations. So we tried to make it very easy to get started and then get going. And then afterward, there's lots of plugins. In fact, more than 700 of those today, allowing you to do all sorts of things. So today, what I wanted to talk about mainly was that for most people guys, when they initially start using Jenkins, they're running automated builds, automated unit tests, that sort of things on Jenkins is normally the first thing they do, and it's very easy to do so. But I guess given the context of this event today, I wanted to talk about how you could start from there, but then grow your usage to cover the bigger scope of automations, aka the deployment or anything else actually for that matter. So how do you evolve, how do you start from something simple and then how do you evolve that usage to something a lot more complex, and the large scale is the focus of my talk today. So put simply, when I say, the broader automations, I think to summarize that in one word would be, I think, the workflow, right? So for those of you who have already used Jenkins, you know that the unit of automation in Jenkins is called a job. So when we talk about the large-scale automation, what we are trying to do is to sort of combine these individual jobs that do small things in a way that creates more interesting things. And then so I call that a workflow. And in a way, it's a little bit like the Lego blocks. Individually, the jobs are single-minded. It only does one thing. But by composing these things, you get to do some more complex stuff. This is something I assembled like a few years ago by using a computer program. But anyway, and then by doing that, I think you get to do another good practice of Jenkins, which is to be able to reuse jobs that you defined in one place in the context of the broader things. So in other words, the power of expressiveness is in the way you compose these things, as opposed to put everything inside this single job. So I wanted to talk about the various concrete techniques. So from then on, it kind of gets technical here. So the first building block that I wanted to introduce is called the Parameterized Builds. So jobs in Jenkins is like a set of instructions for computers to do certain automated tasks. Generally it would look something like check out the source code from one location, and then invoke this the Maven or AMP or whatever build tool you have, and then Jenkins is supposed to go look at these directories to collect test reports. Maybe you have find bugs report generated somewhere else, and then in the end you might notify someone when something bad happens. So it's not too much of a stretch of imagination to think of it as a procedure in your programming language. And in that sense, the way you define these jobs in Jenkins does not have any parameters. So in a way, only thing is every time when it executes this function, the only thing that's changing is the state of the source code that you're checking out. And while that's useful, obviously, when you're doing continuous builds and testing, when you start to think of it for some other things, it becomes convenient to be able to define some additional parameters to change the behavior of the build. So that's what this parameterized build feature is about. Looks like my clicker is dying. So let me switch back. So using parameterized build is pretty easy. You just have to follow the 3 easy steps. The first is that you have to define parameters. So this is, so you give it like a name, the default value, so that the user doesn't have to fill in the value every single time, and the description is whatever text that gets shown to the user to explain what this value is supposed to be about. And then there are all kinds of other types available. So here, as it says, it's a string parameter type, meaning the user is supposed to type in a simple string value. But you could ask the user to upload a file. You could ask the user to select from a number of known options. There's all sorts of flexibility like that. And then the second step is once you define the parameter, you have to defer to these parameters from within the job definitions. So that's the second step you do. You could use a familiar variable expansion syntax like $bracket, and then so perhaps that that might affect the way you invoke certain programs. And these parameters are also exposed as environment variables. So most build tools and shell scripts and whatnot, you can very easily access the environment variable. So you could use that to change the way your build works. And then the third thing is once, as a person who defines the job, once you finish doing that, then when the user tries to do a build, as opposed to having the build starting right away, you come to the UI where they'd be asked to type in the actual parameter values. So in this case, you see that what we defined as a parameter available in there. So the parameterized build is the sort of one of the key critical building blocks. But the way you the nice sort of the companion to that is the parameterized trigger plugin, which is like the way you invoke these parameterized jobs. So one of the key features in this parameterized trigger plugin is to be able to sort of trigger another build of another job and then wait for the completion of it. So without using this plugin, when you combine these job execution, they are essentially like asynchronous queue kind of behavior, right? So you, at the end of the build, you schedule other builds, and then, so the things would cascade, but but this brings in an entirely different semantics of like a subroutine-ish call return kind of semantics. So you could have one job, invoke another job, and then wait for that to complete, and then trigger another one, and so on and so forth. You could also have multiple things invoked and wait for them to complete all at the same time. So in this way, for example, you could very easily have a setup phase. So perhaps the first phase of this might be a setup job, which say deploy the server and then prepare a load generating clients. And in the second phase, you might run these clients to generate lots of load and monitor how the server is holding up. And at the end of it, even if this is failed, let's say you could have a third step that's a cleanup phase, which tears down the server, collect the report, and then provide some sort of analytic details. And so by decomposing things like that, you get the same usability you get from function calls in programming languages. Right? And then, or similarly, you could have like 2 tests or 3 tests that execute in parallel, and then wait for them to all finish, which is one of the other common patterns. So the forking things up and then joining was common enough that there's another separate plugin that just has this join semantics. It's called the join plugin. Also, well, the obvious name. So if what you're trying to do simply fits this kind of model, this like a single purpose plugin might fit you better because it's generally speaking, it's easier to understand. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was when you start using lots of jobs to coordinate on some related activities, it often becomes important to be able to pass the files or the other information around from one build to another. And then this is how you could sort of have information flowing from one end to the other. So the copy artifact plugin is what you use to do this kind of things. What it does is, so what this plugin does is during the build, let's say when you're building HCME test 24, you can sort of grab the archived artifacts from another build and then copy it into the workspace. And then so in that way, now the build could operate on these files. And then this copying is, I guess, is secure, so it makes it easier to do. Now, what makes this interesting is you could use various criteria to choose exactly which build of another project that you're going to copy from. I guess I should mention, like, the canonical example of where you want to copy things is like when you have a build job that produces the jar file, and then when you have a test job that the test on these binaries. Because often you want to design a test in such a way that the target of the test, the subject of the test, could get injected into it, right? So being able to sort of copy it over is often useful in this kind of situations. Now, what makes it really interesting is that because builds are going on all the time, there's a number of different versions of these jar files that's being produced. So in a way, it's a little bit like you have the version controlled binaries available here, because these builds would contain each slightly different binary that contains slightly different set of changes. So what the Jenkins allows you to do is it has a number of system-defined labels, if you may. We call them actually permalinks because originally they were designed for providing a permalinks in the UI. And some of the common ones are like this last stable build, meaning the build of all the build, the last one that passed all the tests that's run so far. So it might be that this is the one that has passed all the tests so far, or this might not have been. There's also other things like this little doc icon, which in Jenkins would mean this is interesting enough bits that someone came to mark as persistent build so that it won't get recorded, and these things also get a label. So when you say, for example, in the test job, you could say, well, this test is really only interested in testing the bits that's known to work so far. So in that case, you might want to pick up the last stable build as the subject of the test, because just picking up the last build, if this is known to break the unit test, there's no point in running more expensive tests on it, right? So that provides a kind of the semantics that's necessary to create a chain of interesting events. But it gets more interesting. I keep grabbing onto it. It gets more interesting if you could actually define these labels to yourself. Because if you think about the sort of continuous deployment, almost by definition in Maven, it tends to span across multiple groups of people. And then when you think about how these people collaborate together, like they sort of depend on this kind of the sort of labeling of a bit. So I used to work for Sun where we had this development team and the QA people, and then the development people are responsible for producing bits. And then at some point, we'd say, well, this bit isn't, it's good enough for us, so it's signed off to the QA people to run the test. So there's a certain degree of trust going on between us that we say, well, we are responsible for delivering this to QA, and the QA would assume those bits aren't dead on arrival, but it's up to us exactly how the developers would glorify the bits as signed off to QA. So that kind of labeling is very useful if you could sort of define them inside Jenkins. And so it's not, instead of just using something like this and try to map your domain concept in there, if you could define your own things. And perhaps if you have a separate deployment team, operation team that deploys bits, they might also be able to use this label that says, well, this is a currently deployed bits in production. And then that kind of thing provides a very useful audit trail through the binaries. And that helps the forensic analysis in case something goes wrong. And then since in most likely case, we are automating these actions in Jenkins. So the developer, I said, well, sorry, so let me try this again. So I mentioned earlier that when the developer team signed off the QA team, the QA team really didn't care exactly how that glorification happens. But chances are, the developers will have some sort of process defined within that does that, and then it's probably automated in Jenkins. Right? So as a development team, perhaps our criteria is that once the build is complete, you run some sort of sanity sanity test that say he finishes in 1 hour, and we also run, say, time bugs report to make sure that it's not worse than what it used to be. And then if both of them are okay, then let's say we are marking this build as signed off to QA, because that's the definition of good enough for dev is. So between these things, by combining these things, and then if we could just let Jenkins automatically shuffle these things, like the Jenkins is capable of certainly running these individual steps. And so if we could have Jenkins also be responsible for assigning these labels to the proper build and then notifying the other parties inside the system about these changes, then that could be a very useful input to sort of have multiple loosely connected teams collaborate and then form a what amounts to be a continuous deployment process. So the plugin in Jenkins that does that is called the promoted builds plugin. So it's called promotion because somehow that was the jargon that's used inside Sun to represent this fact that the dev team was signing off the bits to QA, or the QA team are signing off the bits for release. So the idea is that you specify on the criteria of promotion in previous slide. That meant these bits get promoted if those two projects did successfully pass. Okay? And then if the bits gets promoted, what happens afterward is the other thing. And then so by doing that, again, so that you could create sort of this transition handoff point, or the transition point of the state, without sort of tying that state into exactly how that happens. But often those two things are very independent. And then the fact that you can hide exactly how the bits are codified and promoted from the people consuming those promoted builds is very useful. Like, another thing that often happened in Sun is like, well, we are 1 week before the release, right? So we are supposed to have the bits ready, but of course we have just one more bug that we just need to fix. But the testing the change is going to take another 3 days, and we can't afford that. So when the last fixes come in, you get together with the QA team and basically explain that, look, this change is just 3-line change. You surely don't have to run all these 3-day tests. And they basically look together and say, okay, all right, we know that we have to release it, so I'll just give you the stamp of approval, even though we haven't tested the whole thing. And then, so that's another kind of example where the qualification is important, but exactly how you come back to it is not particularly interesting, right? So we need to be able to skip that kind of, do that kind of sort of, how do you call it, the sidestepping of the processes when necessary. Or as our mechanism evolve, we might start doing more strict testing before the developer or the promoter gets to QA. And when changes like that happens, we don't want the QA team to be affected by our internal process change in the dev. So these plugins will really help you shield from that kind of differences. So let's see. So I wanted to should have time to show it. So this is so let's say first explanation. So this is my made up the promotion environment. So we have the one job that's building the jar file, and then we have like a 2 tests that doing some sort of qualification of these bits. So let's say these are the developer tests that sort of run some test lightly. And there's so these like 3 jobs, they are owned by the developers. And then there's another step that's owned by the QA team that's called the full cycle testing. So imagine this is the one that takes 3 days to run fully. And then finally there's the deployment step, which is the owned by the operation team for the actually pushing this into a production environment. So what we do is inside the jobs that produces the jar file, we have defined these promotion steps. So let's see, the first promotion step is that the developer test has passed. So we say that the criteria for the promotion is when these 2 jobs have successfully passed. And then there's actually nothing that happens. So this is just saying that there is no action defined. So all this is basically doing is to sort of publicize into the rest of the world that these bits are good. So that's sort of, given the orange star icon. So you see like lots of builds with orange star icon meaning these builds are passed okay. And then there's a separate job. The second stage of promotion is called the QA complete. So this promotion signifies that we have an OK from the QA team. And so this time we gave a different color, and the promotion criteria is also different, and it's picking up from the HCME flow test, so the job that's owned by the QA team. And then the third step is the deploy. So this one means it has been successfully deployed to whatever environment. So that one finally get the gold, I guess the already yellow star here. So that's how sort of things are composed. So one of the things that this is useful, this is good at, is to incorporate a asynchronous flow of events. So let me just start the build to create the events. It should be now running. So it's not. So I made it so that once the build is complete, I'm automatically triggering the HCME test 1 and test 2 in parallel. So that's also often a common setup, right? And then, but the full test, so this owned by the QA, we have configured it to be triggered when the promotion happens. So this is also, in this case, I suppose this is running right after the build gets successfully tested by the developers. But often, if a QA team isn't completely automated, which is often the case, then they might, instead of triggering this like automatically, they might actually have to do it like every once a day, perhaps driven by polling or the building periodically, like every midnight, followed by some manual testing to complete this. So that kind of asynchrony would work very well in promotion. So you don't have to have this sequence of pipelines that entirely consists of synchronous steps. And then here's where I'm using, for example, the copy artifact plugin. So I'm copying, to test the binary, I need to grab the binary, right? So I'm copying that binary from the HCME build job, which produces the draw files. But in specifying which build to grab from, I'm picking up the promotion, that the last binary that successfully got promoted under this criteria. So in this way, I avoid testing the dead-on arrival builds. So let's see. So this is failing because I made the build to fail like randomly. So the randomness is a little bit big. So often this makes my demo difficult. But so say this is another often common situation that say the tester failed not because the binary was bad, but because the test environment had some issue, right? Maybe the test code needed to be updated. So again, there's a QA team I could work on these issues independently. And when I want to just rerun the test, I could simply just click this build now and then re-execute the test with whatever current set of tests. And then thanks to this permalink mechanism, I'm still picking up the build that I'm supposed to be testing, regardless of what developers are doing at the same time. And eventually, when the build passes, and if you go back to the build job, you'll get the second red star, the QA completed, because the Jenkins was able to track back which build was which build was being tested. And then finally, we have this deployment job. So in this case, for the purpose of demo, I also made it automatically start whenever promotion will happen. But normally, when something, let's say if you're talking about deployment to the actual production environment, that might be something you want to have some human intervention on, right? You might not always want this kind of thing to happen automatically just because there's a new bit available. So in that kind of situation, you could very easily imagine just unchecking this trigger and then manually click the build now button by someone who is responsible for it. So again, another key benefit in defining processes with this promotion is that you could also incorporate the human into the approval chains. So the copy artifact plugin is good and all when for most things, but where it fails down is kind of the Maven or where Maven, which wants to download the binary on its own terms. So you can't really copy the artifact into the workspace to get Maven pick those things up. You have to have them in places where you can download from Maven. So there's another plugin called Maven repository plugin that does just that. The idea here is, well, in every build, the binaries are produced, and then it's, the Jenkins is a web server. So basically, all we have to do to make it consumable for Maven is to expose these files into certain known directory structure. So that's what we do here. So let me see if I need to find some Maven job. Where is my Maven job? It's here. So for example, right, so in every build you see this build artifact has Maven repository link, and then that basically shows you the binary here. But this will basically give the artifacts into in the file structure that the Maven understands. So you can make it, you can have it download from there's no binary here, but you can very easily have it download from Maven, and so in that way you could control exactly which build Maven is testing. So that's a little nice companion. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the visualization. So so far, especially in the promoted builds, we didn't have any comprehensive view of how the whole pipeline was to look like. So in other words, we have these like an individual edge traversal, like we have this like a 5 or 6 jobs that's interconnected to do something interesting. Right? On the other hand, the relationship between these guys aren't very obvious if you're just looking at the UI, because all we have is this like upstream, downstream things that tells you where the neighbors are, but it doesn't give you the overall picture. So there's a number of plugins in this space as well that you want to combine. One of those easy ones is called the dependency graph plugin. So this just shows you like an entire dependency graph in a single picture. This black line indicates like the trigger relationship. So we have the build that's triggering the test, the full test, which is triggering the deployment, and then all these shallow blue lines, these are showing how the binaries are copied. So they are often also used for information in terms of how the bits are flowing. So it's also captured in the graph. Another very common plugin is this the build pipeline plugin, which gives you, I guess, a more familiar pipeline-ish view of things. In the current version of it, this only works with like upstream, downstream chaining. So we are improving this to work with the promotion and other way of defining the choreography. But the nice thing about it is that it sort of gives you a page that you can put up somewhere that the people can see, and then so let me actually start the new pipeline instance. Oops. Right, and so these pages will update by themselves, and then when things so this is saying that this step didn't work, and then so this is successful pipeline locations. I'm not sure something is behaving fine. Oh, I guess I just have to be patient. And so now it started the test job, and then I made the test. Well, actually, this time it succeeded. I wanted it to fail. So let me run it again. Okay. So now this guy went through the deployment. So the deployment phase, and while there are another instance is running. So what makes this kind of view often useful is the fact that you can see everything in one place is one of those. But what's really more useful is because if you're a developer who is committing changes, so normally this pipeline instance gets triggered because you have changes, right? Succeeded again. All right. It's it works because so say you're the guy. So you're the guy who committed changes here, and then because you aren't entirely sure if the changes should work, you wanted to keep track of like how far your changes. Like sometimes you have a situation like this where the change went successfully to the build, but it failed in the test, and then that's naturally of interest to someone who made changes in that guy. So since my random is not helping me, so I just thought, oh, okay, no, I think it did. So And then when it fails, I mean, I could look into the situations, or I could simply sort of rerun the same build from where it failed, and then it'll hopefully next time it work, and then I could see it to the completion. So that's the basic idea about this plugin. Right, I need to pick up the piece here. So that's the little demo. And then the next topic I wanted to explain is the fingerprints. And this is still a concept that I struggle to explain well. So this is my current attempt of like what this is supposed to mean. And so often, I guess, as a people who use Jenkins, we're used to look at the sort of the flow of events inside Jenkins from certain angle, namely the jobs and the workflow. So you define, like like we did in previous demo, we have like a 4 or 5 jobs defined, each one scheduled after or before certain things, and then in the mental, in the mind, you could sort of kind of picture what it looks like. But it's actually only one way of looking at that. And so I thought the analogy of that is the air travel, and you can see where I came up with this analogy, obviously, is that I guess as a government, the official, you could design how things are structured inside the airport, right? Because the passengers normally have to go through certain things in certain order. So you have like a check-in counter. I guess once you arrive to the airport, you have a check-in counter, and then you have to go through the security afterward, and then at the gate you have to go through another sort of process that they scan your boarding pass and whatnot. And of course, like you might have some sort of like immigration step somewhere in between. So that's one way, that's one view of the event of like how things are working. And then in Jenkins also there's another way of looking at the same data. That is, if you're looking at a single job, you can see all the builds that happened in the past. So that's like if you have the CCTV on the airline counter, you can see all the passenger come to certain desk and then go through it, right? And then that's another obviously often useful view, but that's still not the only way to look at the data. And in fact, what the fingerprint provides is the third view on the same data, which is you could track like a single passenger as they go through these processes, and then you could sort of see at what time he came to the airline counter, what was its outcome, and what he did next, and then what was the outcome of that, and like when he went through the boarding gate and stuff like that. So the way it works is that the fingerprint, what I call as fingerprint, is a checksum of a file. So say you have a build that's produced at some point. Every build produces a slightly different set of jar files, so every file has a different checksum. And then when you test it, if you also record the checksum of the file that's being tested, and then if the checksum would match, we don't have a slide in next page. Yeah, so if you, right, I'm sorry, I guess I have a slide in next page that I supposed to show. So here we have a build that produces like a file of certain checksum, and at some later point in time, there's another test that has run, and that it turns out that when we checksum the file that was being tested, it had the same checksum. So from these two facts, we could determine that the binary that was tested in the test 13 was actually the binary that's produced in build 15, quite unambiguously, also without really knowing about how the bits have traveled from one to the other. So, perhaps the way you do things is by having a binary uploaded into the Maven repository, so those things live outside Jenkins. And maybe this guy is like running only once a day. So in those kind of situations, there's nothing that immediately associates these two executions, but but in this case, by computing the checksum, and we know that these things have appeared. This same file has appeared in these two places. So this kind of thing is, if it's done on people, those are called big brothers, or like a 1984-ish kind of world, which I guess not so incidentally, a few days ago we discovered that the NSA might be actually doing that. But in case of computers, this kind of tracking is often quite useful, because say if this file eventually hit the production deployment, and then you discover some issues in there, and then you could mechanically track things down so that it came from this build. And then from here, you can look at all the changes and commits that have happened to it. So in this way, you could have a sort of like a mechanical first-step forensic analysis. So that's the kind of things the Jenkins could provide, which really assists when you have a large-scale automations. I guess, right, in Europe, didn't you guys have like an E. coli outbreak like a few summers ago? Yeah. So, am I making this up, or does that involve? Anyway, so say some like a food contamination happens, right? And then the government could actually track down which farm it came from. So it's really the same idea. And then when you have these kind of things, I think it's really sort of useful in reducing the amount it takes to understand what the problem is. So the fingerprint is a way of providing that degree of transparency to your processes. So once you start collecting this data, there's inside the job configuration, you see where you can tell Jenkins to record fingerprinting stuff. But once you start recording this data, you can use that data in many interesting ways. So for example, one of those is you could sort of have multiple projects side by side. So let's say this is a job that's producing binaries, and here is the job that's testing it. And then you can see them sort of, you can sort of cross-reference these things. The way you read this is the binary that's produced in build 1 is showed up in this test. The binary produced here showed up here. So if you're only looking at the build history of this guy, it looks like everything was successful, and so it's good. But by contrasting this with that, you can sort of learn a lot more interesting things. So here, even though we attempted to test this twice, both of them failed. So presumably, like, there's something wrong with this binary. Right? In contrast here, you see that the first test failed, but the second test has run okay. And then this would tell us that it's testing the same binary. So presumably, this failure came from something else. And so often these things give you more insights. That's not immediately obvious if you're looking at just the build history of a single job. So that's a bit about the visualizations. There are a lot more that I'd love to talk, but in the interest of covering other topics, let's move on. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is, well, so far when we defined the workflows, it was sort of the definition, the chunk of the definition was in one job. There's another chunk of definition in another job, and so on. So the workflow as a whole wasn't defined in a single place, but instead it was sort of spread across in multiple jobs. So next, what I wanted to talk about was what it takes to define a workflow in a single place. Again, where I used to work in these bigger quote-unquote enterprise companies, often these broader automation had to span across multiple teams. So in those environments, having the definitions split out into multiple teams actually made sense. That was a feature, not a bug, because individually they are autonomous. But if you are sort of more like a smaller agile team, you might be actually the sole team that's responsible for the entire pipeline. And in that kind of situation, the splitting out the definition of the workflow into separate places is not a feature. It's just a tediousness. So in those environments, we can also let you define everything in a single place. The first plugin that I wanted to talk about that does that is called the Build Flow plugin. And what it does is it comes with this little programming language built on top of Groovy that lets you invoke jobs and builds in an interesting way. So we provide this, the reason it's called DSL is because we provide these primitives that kind of really helps you with the interacting with Jenkins. So the way this works is first it executes one build, and then wait for that to complete, and then make the result available as variable B. There's a guard rescue block here, which is basically like a try catch. So what this is saying is execute the portion here, even if it fails or succeeds, like make sure to execute that guy. So we're using that to make sure that always the tear down phase is happening. And then finally, there's a parallel task here, which means execute this guy and then that guy in parallel. And then, so it's passing in the small parameters and stuff like that. So you could, if you're a programmer, you could sort of make good sense out of it. And then because it's built on top of Ruby, you can have this script talk to lots of the interesting external systems you might have to create fairly rich the workflow like semantics. And then the good thing about it is that it also comes with the visualization support. And so you can, after the fact, you can see what has happened. So here is my build flow defined. So let's see. So all I'm doing, I guess, is I'm calling. I'm basically just doing what I had shown on the slide. So instead of using, so now you're calling the say hello job is passing into different parameters here. And then let me just run this guy. And then once I start doing it, it'll start tracking what it's doing. And also, so that's like a textual tracking of what happened, but there's also a GUI that that's supposed to help you with the ordering of things. And we can jump to its output to see the parameters that it got. So this one is saying hello London, the other guy is sending hello Kosuke. And I thought this was supposed to be, I think it's supposed to be able to give you the arrows that connect these things in relationship, but maybe he changed that in this program. But anyway, so it does come with this degree of tracking. So it makes it sort of a very powerful tool for doing more sophisticated workflow. There's another plugin that approaches this problem from somewhat different angle, which is called the Jenkins on the workflow plugin. So the problem with the DSL is that if you're not a programmer, this will not speak to you. Like, it does not make any sense. Which, if you ask me, is a feature as a developer. But if you're sort of not, if you're interested in sort of a workflow definition that can be approached by multiple stakeholders, then something like this is a lot more approachable. So this is there's a standard OMG standard called the business process with markup notation, I think, called it's like an XML language and graphical notation for defining workflow. So as the B and P in the acronym would indicate, this kind of workflow definition has been used a lot in the sort of business process automations. So it's a pretty expressive workflow language that comes with all sorts of whistles and bells, like timeouts, or you could have like a sequence of events that time out at some point, or you could have like an override into the second escalation process, or you can have a step that says one of the engineers needs to sign no for. You can do all sorts of interesting integrations that the real world needs. And then you could define this. The addition of this Jenkins plugin is that you can use these tasks, these steps that invokes Jenkins jobs. So here in this thing, you could see like it starts off with running some automated script, and then it branches off the execution into two halves, and then these two things would run concurrently. And when they are both over, it runs something, and then the workflow would be over. So this is as far as the workflow goes, this is a pretty simple one. But you can imagine when you combine this with like a human process, like say you might have like a manual approval from point to here boss, and then deploy to the server. And if the boss doesn't approve within 2 days, you can have like an engineering lead override, or you can go quite fancy about that. And then this plugin comes with the Eclipse plugin to edit these workflow definition inside the Eclipse. And you could, the version workflow definitions are also version controlled inside the Git repository. So when people can track changes across different versions of the workflows, and then you could also define workflow in single place and deploy them en masse at multiple servers and do some sort of these serious organizational thing. So I think I should have time to show that. So here inside Eclipse, so let's see. I mean, actually, first thing first. So if you go to the Jenkins, I have that plugin already installed. So if you go to the page, you see the instruction how you can check out this workspace from Jenkins. So Jenkins itself, in this case, is acting as a Git repository. So you do not have to have a separate repository to store the workflows. So you just have to run this command to check out the workspace, which I already did, and then open that up inside Eclipse. And then so you see that there's a workflow definition files. I think it's in here. So the .bpmn file, and then you see like a the drag and drop things that you could play with. So I'm not going to modify the workflow definition, because instead let me just move around to create like a bit more prettier pictures or whatever. So let's say I change the way the pictures look like. And then, so let me save that change. And then as a designer of the workflow, I could say team commits changes. Workflow has been updated to make our box happy. And then I do the commit and push. And then push is basically, send the changes up into Jenkins. And I think it went in. So if I look at the Jenko plugin, here you see that the workflow has now changed to the definition that I updated to. And then if I just run it, then this workflow will start executing. Another good thing about this Jenko plugin is that the workflow engine is like a fully persistent, meaning you can have it's not unheard of in a big organization to hear the release process that takes like in the order of a week, because it has to go through so many stages and so many stakeholders. So in that sort of environment, having a long-running workflow during which you can shut down Jenkins and bring it back up and then still remember all the state is actually pretty useful. So this plugin would allow you to do that sort of things. And as I guess I've already mentioned, but in BPMN workflow, you could have humans that's involved in this task execution. So we sort of bundle up the software that does that, called Activity Explorer, and the people could come in and see the things that they are supposed to approve or supposed to look at, and so that is also work pretty well. So these both plugins that I just showed are still under active development, but I think they are already pretty useful, and the developer would love to hear from you guys. So the last thing, I think this is the last topic that I wanted to talk about, was between those two plugins, we kind of covered how to define the choreography in one place. So the relationship between how these jobs should work. They are captured inside a single place, and they are a lot easier to see what's going on. The last thing that I wanted to touch on is, the thing that we didn't centralize in the previous two plugins is the definition of jobs themselves. So far we have jobs defined individually, but we stripped away all the choreography related things and then moved them into either DSL or the BPMN definitions. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is how you could actually define all these jobs in a single place. Because this is often another problem that we have, is that we have a lot of jobs that look similar or the same, or that needs to be cookie cutter from single definitions. The one plugin that's done by, I think this is done by the guys from Netflix, is called the Job DSL plugin. So it's using yet another Groovy DSL. But still the base language is the Groovy, but the DSLness is like in here. So you see like this job tag or the SCN tag. So there's a small number of these guys defined to let you sort of construct a Jenkins job out of these like programmatically. So what this screenshot, what this program example is doing, in the first 3 lines or so, I am talking to the GitHub to figure out the branches in my repository. And then for each branch, I'm creating a job by automatically picking up the name of the branch as a part of the job name, and then it's going to pick up this branch and whatnot. And then so in this way, you don't have to manually create a new job for a new branch. And then this whole script itself, you can run it from inside Jenkins as a job. So the way you would set up something like this is that you can have it monitor changes in the GitHub repository. So whenever someone pushes a new branch into GitHub, this will run, and then it automatically create a job for that branch. So for the people in the product team, they just need to wait for like 5 minutes or so, and then their job would be automatically there building the changes, which is really nice. So the challenge with DSL, the challenge with this kind of DSL is we are used to configuring job inside Jenkins in the GUI. So exactly how that checkboxes and text fields that map into this kind of syntax is actually not very obvious, and it's somewhat tedious. So often probably a more practical thing to do is by actually using this, using the instruction. What it's doing is pick up the job definition from this job and then only change the portion that I'm overwriting. Right? So in the previous example of creating a new job for GitHub branch, this is far more practical in the sense that you can just create one job, and then whenever this gets redone, all the jobs that's created from it gets automatically updated from what you created. You could also go down to like a go read XML definition if you want to, but I guess I won't go too much into that. And then another way that appeal more to like a power hacker kind of guys is that Jenkins offer a command line interface. So you could talk to Jenkins as if it's a SSH server. There's a certain port that Jenkins advertises, and if you connect to it, it speaks the SSH server protocol, but it actually implements Jenkins specific command. And like when you run this get job command, it types out the definition of job in XML. So you can very easily pipe that things around with a little bit of scripting to backtape them all together, and then you can do some massive search and replace like this or whatever that you fancy. And then another thing, so in this case, for example, the CloudBees in our Jenkins Enterprise by CloudBees, which I think some of us will be happy to talk in the booth outside, came up with the template plugin, which also shares some traits with this kind of job DSL. So it allows you to define a job once and generate like instances of this template. But it also comes in a bit different in that you can define templates in GUI, and also also the individual instances of this template will see a very limited configuration, and so the user won't be able to modify things that they are not supposed to modify. So that's the sort of the quick tour around some of the building blocks that you need to create a larger scale orchestration of things. So hopefully, some of these are new to you, and I hope you'll be able to take advantage of these things in your own installations. So with that, I think I should have 5 more minutes. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
You said earlier, like often it's desirable to have a manual step as part of your pipeline.
Right.
What's the best way to sort of incorporate that in a way that can be visualized?
Yes, so in a way that gets visualized is a bit of challenge. So today, the way I recommend people do the manual step is either, let's see, so in the promotion, I could define the criteria as manually approved. So instead of saying, this build gets promoted when certain things automatically pass, I could say only when manually approved. And I could sort of like have a group, so the name defined as approvers, and then so that would create, create semantics. But the problem is that this plugin doesn't interact you can't use the pipeline plugin to visualize this. So in terms of the visualization, it's a little bit lacking. The BPMN stuff does have excellent visualization, but it's also a bit heavyweight. So it kind of depends on where you are. I suppose another cheaper way to do this is like I was showing in the demo. Right? You could say the approval meaning like clicking this button, and it also leaves the trails. And this kind of workflow would work better with the build pipeline view like we saw before. So that might be another way to go about it. So sorry for not clear-cut answer, but that's the state of the art here.
The build pipeline plugin hasn't been released in quite some time since it's been developed.
Yes, so yes, you're right that as is often the case with other Jenkins plugins, for the original guy who wrote this plugin, this does everything he needs, so he moved on, right? As far as he's concerned, this is complete. And of course, like for the rest of us, we think like, oh, if only this could do something a little better. So I was actually hacking on this code a few weeks ago to be able to sort of plug in like a promoted build support into it. And then so we now folded the code back into the GitHub Jenkins org, and so I hope to be able to issue a release soon. So this is still, I consider this a very important part of the plugins, and so yeah, we intend to keep it going.
Can you recommend any views for sort of the test environment view of the world? So what are the different tasks perhaps affecting the same environment? We're going to look at that environment and see the history of what happens to it.
Right. Yes. Yes. Thank you. So the question was like, isn't it useful to be able to like define the model, the test environment as external to Jenkins, and then sort of keep track of the activities that's happening in Jenkins that deals with test environment? And that's very much true. It's actually one of the things that's being, this space is like one of the things being worked on. So one of the phone companies up north, I guess not from north here, I guess. Anyway, so they came up with that. They have this similar issue. Like they have a number of physical devices that they need to use. So in their mind, the testing consists of flashing the new software into the device and then interact with it. So they wanted to keep track of which device is being used by which tester and how and when and stuff like that. So they came up with a plugin called external resource plugin, or external something, I forgot the name, with the idea that you could sort of model them and then define usage of them. So I wanted to take it a bit further and then add more visualization angle. So that's some of this is still very much in the works, so not quite at the point that I could present neatly, but this is I guess it's a lot of it's a thing that a lot of other people are thinking about. So I expect more work to be done in this space as well. All right, I guess.
When you trigger a build from ownership, is it possible to find out the parameters from the build you're promoting?
So the question was, when I promote the build, can I find out what? Oh yes. So yes, I can find out. So, right. So the part of, the whole point of doing promotion is to provide the audit trail, right? So we need to be able to track where things have happened. So if you look at this promotional status, you could see that, first of all, we see that it has successfully got all the promotion. But this is, for example, where you see so exactly what build was qualifying this build, right? We said if the builds pass the test 1 and test 2, they qualified as test pass, but exactly which build. So this provides these trails. And then you can also see like a time information, so this was, I guess this happened like 36 minutes ago or something, right in the middle of the talk, and then that took about 15 seconds after the build. But this time is also interesting to see how long your process is taking to actually qualify the build. So that I find a useful measure. And then you could sort of see similar auditing trail across the board.
Yeah, but while I was after this, in that deployment job, can I pull in the parameters of the original build?
So in the deployment job, can you pull in the parameters from the original job? I don't think so, but it's a great idea. I think we should be about that. Yeah. So sorry about that, but thanks for the suggestion.
Can I do that with the build pipeline plugin? As long as you use the snapshot view.
Can I? I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
You can pass the parameters and trigger parameterized builds through the build pipeline plugin.
Yes.
But only in the snapshot version.
Only in the snapshot version. I think you're referring to the feature in the build parameter. I think he was trying to offer the solution to what you're asking, which is great. So someone knows more about Jenkins than I do, which I love. And I think he was suggesting that if I use the parameterized trigger plugin like this guy, I could say, I could simply pass the current set of parameters downstream. I'm not sure what. Anyway, we can talk more about that. So that's that. All right, so I think that's about it for me in time-wise. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it.